Picture yourself in the marble halls of ancient Greece, not as a warrior, not as a philosopher, but as something far more secretive, a male concubine. Behind the statues and poetry, the Greeks lived with customs that blurred the lines between love power and possession. Young men were taken into the households of the elite, praised in public as symbols of beauty, yet in private bound to roles of obedience and intimacy. What looked like privilege from the outside often carried chains of silent secrecy and control. This is the story the philosophers rarely put in, writing the hidden arrangements, the whispered rules, and the shocking truths of what life was like for those chosen for desire instead of freedom. Drop the time you're watching this in the comments. I love seeing when my history travelers arrive. And if you enjoy unearthing history's forbidden sides, subscribing is totally your choice, but the next secrets go even deeper. They don't ask for your strength. They don't care how many stones you can carry from the quarry, or whether you could row a trireme across the Aegean. What they want is your face, the way your eyes catch the light, the softness in your voice, the posture you hold when you sit in silence. And suddenly, that becomes the most valuable thing you own. In a city like Athens, where the walls are decorated with murals of heroes and the temples gleam with marble gods, you are not chosen for battle or philosophy, but for presence. What a strange twist of fate, to live in a society that worships strength and wisdom, and yet find yourself trained to be admired like a living sculpture. Your life changes quickly. One morning, you are just another boy, playing in the dust, your hair uncombed, your hands stained with olive oil from the family press. The next, you are being pulled into a world of instructions. Older servants, sharper-eyed than hawks, begin to tell you how to stand, how to walk, how to breathe. You learn that even silence has a shape. A smile too wide looks naive. A frown too deep looks dangerous. So, you rehearse in front of a polished bronze mirror, adjusting the tilt of your head, the softness of your lips. Have you ever noticed how exhausting it is to pretend all the time? That is your new profession, pretending gracefully. Training is relentless. You are expected to glide across marble floors without making a sound, to sit on benches carved like thrones, as if you were born to them, and to pour wine into goblets without spilling a drop. Every mistake is corrected sharply. Not like that. Again, it almost feels like choreography, and in a way it is. The Greeks loved symmetry, order, and beauty. You are being shaped to fit into their obsession. Think of it like becoming part of a play where you never get to leave the stage and the audience never stops watching. The strangest lesson comes in conversation. You are told to listen more than you speak, to laugh lightly at jokes you barely understand, to answer questions with just enough wit to flatter without stealing attention. A nod at the right moment, a chuckle at another. These become as important as knowing how to read or write. You realize you are being taught the art of invisibility and presence at the same time. Isn't that ironic, to be seen everywhere, but remembered nowhere? Soon, you start to notice how eyes follow you in public. At the market, as women haggle over fish and men argue about politics, you feel stares prickling your back. People whisper, some in envy, others in mockery. They mutter about softness, luxury, decadence. Yet beneath their criticism is a flicker of longing. Who wouldn't want the easier life, the silk robes instead of coarse wool, the plates of figs and honey instead of barley bread? It's a reminder that envy often wears the mask of judgment. But this life is not only about appearances. Alongside your training, You are exposed to lessons in music, poetry, and philosophy. You sit cross-legged, while lyres hum softly in the background, memorizing verses that celebrate love and beauty. You overhear philosophers in shaded courtyards arguing about virtue, justice, and the soul. You are not expected to lead these conversations, but you are expected to absorb enough to survive them. Later, when a patron asks your opinion, you must have something clever, yet safe to say. A small phrase, a borrowed thought, becomes a shield. After all, if you sound ignorant, you become disposable. And then there are the role models, the legends whispered into your ear. You hear stories of Alcibiades, the dazzling statesman, who turned heads in every symposium. His beauty and wit were as powerful as any army he commanded. Or Phaedo, once a boy in a similar position, who later became a philosopher whose dialogues still ripple through history. These names remind you that even someone trained in silence can find ways to leave an echo. Do you ever wonder how many lives are spent building echoes instead of monuments? Still, you feel the pressure of being both admired and owned. Your reflection in the polished mirror is not just yours anymore. It belongs to the household that displays you, to the patrons who benefit from your charm. At times, you dream about simpler work. A fisherman rising at dawn to cast nets into the sea, a potter spinning clay with steady hands. Their lives may be harder, but their identities are their own. Yours feels borrowed, wrapped in silk and expectation. Every day teaches you to notice the unspoken. A patron's narrowed eyes signal danger. A rival's smirk hints at jealousy. A gift of jewelry whispers both affection and obligation. You begin to understand that power in this world rarely shouts. It sighs, it gestures, it lingers in a glance across a banquet hall. Your task is to read it, respond to it, and survive it. That is what your face has bought you a place in a silent war of attention. And as you smooth your cloak, preparing once again to step into another evening of measured smiles and careful words, you realize something: you have become both a person and a performance. A mirror, polished to reflect what others want to see, yet still carrying within you the restless question: how long can you keep the mask from cracking? The villa smells faintly of olive oil, beeswax, and smoke from the kitchen hearth. This is where your days unfold, not in the bustling agora or the noisy shipyards, but behind heavy wooden doors, guarded by servants who know exactly who comes in and out. The mornings are filled with rituals, and those rituals are your lifeline. You rise early, not because you want to, but because others will inspect you. Have you ever noticed how exhausting it is when your appearance is judged before your words? That is your entire reality. First comes grooming. Slaves bring pitchers of water, pouring it slowly over your shoulders as you wash away the night. Your hair is combed with care-scented oils, rubbed into your skin until you glisten like polished marble. The Greeks loved the sight of youth, adorned as if the gods themselves had stepped off a temple pediment. And you, though just human, are made to mimic divinity. The fabrics you wear are not always the finest silks. This is Greece, not Persia, but even linen, when dyed with bright saffron or deep purple, transforms you into something more than ordinary. Imagine a modern celebrity spending hours with a stylist before a red carpet event. That's you only. Your red carpet is the villa courtyard, and the audience is a select circle of powerful eyes. Once dressed, you are ushered into lessons. A lyre is placed in your hands, the strings biting into your fingertips as you learn to pluck out delicate melodies. Music is not simply for entertainment, it is part of your performance. At symposia, when the air is thick with wine and conversation drifts toward poetry, your skill can turn silence into admiration. Then comes recitation. Homer's lines, well worn, but never stale, flow from your lips as you practice with a tutor. Sing, O Muse. You begin, and though you are no bard, you must carry the sound of one. Can you imagine the pressure of being expected to recite epic tales while every guest measures your every word? But behind these refinements lies another quieter training presence. You are coached in the art of standing still without fading, of being graceful without looking stiff. At dinners, you might be positioned to serve wine, but your true task is to be noticed without speaking. Patrons watch you out of the corner of their eye, weighing your posture like a sculptor judges marble for flaws. A crooked elbow, a frown too deep, and you risk ridicule. It feels absurd, doesn't it? Yet it matters here as much as a soldier's spear matters on the battlefield. And the villa itself plays a role in shaping you. The floors beneath your sandaled feet are mosaics depicting myths. Heracles wrestling the lion, Theseus facing the Minotaur. You walk across these heroes every day, reminded constantly of strength and struggle, while your own struggle is to hold a tray without trembling. Outside vines heavy with grapes curl around trellises, their sweetness destined for amphorae of wine you one day serve. Even the setting whispers that your role is ornamental, a human accessory in a larger performance of wealth and refinement. There is humor in all of this, though. Picture a philosopher, like Socrates, wandering in with his crooked nose and shabby cloak, surrounded by young men who admire his mind rather than his grooming. Then compare that to your morning routine: oils, fabrics, lessons, posture. Which life would you rather live? The one, mocked for ugliness, but praised for wisdom, or the one admired for beauty, but spoken of in hushed tones behind closed doors? It's a question that lingers like incense in the air. Sometimes, when you sit quietly in the courtyard, you notice the contrast between your reality and the bustle outside the gates. A farmer trudges past with baskets of olives, his back bent, but his mind free of the performances you must maintain. He may envy your fine clothes, but would he envy the way your smile has to be rehearsed? Survival, you realize, comes in many forms, and yours just happens to be polished rather than rough. The afternoons bring more subtle duties. You might be called to read letters aloud, to sing softly in the background while patrons discuss business, or simply to be present in silence. It is in silence, after all, that the Greeks believed character could be judged. They watch you when you think no one is watching, and that is when your real test begins. Do you stand tall, even when alone? Do you keep your composure when bored? These details matter more than you'd like to admit. And yet there are perks. Platters of figs and honey wine, diluted just enough to keep you clear-headed, the luxury of reclining on cushions while others labor in the fields. These are small comforts, but they remind you that your place, however fragile, is still above the grinding poverty outside. You are, in essence, living as part of a theater troupe, where the performance never ends, but the pay is better than most could dream of. So the villa, with its marble pillars and endless rituals, becomes both your sanctuary and your stage. Behind its doors, you are polish-shaped and trained every day, a rehearsal for an audience that may never applaud. And as the sun dips low, casting golden light through the colonnades, you prepare yourself for the evening, the moment when the villa doors open and you step into a world where charm is both armor and weapon. By evening, the villa grows louder. Lamps are lit, shadows stretch across the walls, and the air begins to thrum with voices. This is when you step into a world where beauty and politics lie tangled together like vines on a trellis. The Greeks never separated desire from power. It was all part of the same theater, and you standing there with your cloak smoothed and your hair glistening are both actor and pawn in the drama of the bedchamber. You soon learn that affection is never just affection here. When a powerful patron places a hand lightly on your shoulder or leans too close while you refill his cup, it's not only about attraction. It's about signaling dominance, about showing others that he possesses something rare. You are both companion and symbol, as if your very presence announces his influence. Do you see how unsettling that is, to be a person and a statement at the same time? The Greeks, particularly in cities like Athens, had a culture where relationships between older patrons and younger companions were not unusual. Philosophers like Plato even wrote about it, sometimes elevating it as a path toward wisdom, other times warning of its corruption. You hear whispers these ideas, though no one speaks them aloud in the middle of a feast. Instead, you live the reality of affection that doubles as politics. A glance across the room is less about romance and more about rivalry. Who looks at you longest? Who claims you most openly? Who treats you like treasure? And who treats you like property? Each gesture carries weight. At the same time, there is a constant undercurrent of secrecy. Patrons may have wives, families' reputations to protect. You exist in the shadow of that respectability. During the day, you might walk a step behind them in public, your presence explained away as just a servant. But at night, when the symposium ends and the house grows quieter, the lines blur. Suddenly, your whispered words mean more than gold. Your silence holds more power than speeches. And yet none of it belongs to you. Isn't it strange how intimacy can feel both real and borrowed? You realize quickly that jealousy is never far away. Rivals circle like hawks other companions or courtiers who would gladly see you stumble. They spread rumors, subtle digs disguised as casual remarks. He laughed too loudly at the wrong man's joke. He spilled wine when serving. A small mistake becomes a weapon in someone else's hands. And when jealousy mixes with politics, the fallout can be brutal. One whispered accusation could lower your standing overnight. Think of it like office politics today, the small gossip, the cutting remarks. Only here the consequences don't mean losing a desk job. They mean losing the entire life of protection you've been given. Even philosophers weighed in on relationships like yours. You've probably heard of Xenophon, who described the ideal companion as loyal, witty, and morally upright. Easy enough to write, harder to live. How do you balance being loyal when everyone around you plays a game of alliances? How do you stay witty when you know every word you say is weighed like silver and morality? That's a flexible concept when survival depends on pleasing men who shape laws and lead armies. At times you catch fragments of tenderness, moments that feel genuine. A patron smiles at something you say not because of politics, but because you've genuinely amused him. Or he defends you in front of rivals, brushing aside their criticisms. Those moments warm you, but you never let yourself believe in them fully. You know better. Trust here is like thin glass. It glitters beautifully, but shatters at the first strike. And what about the wives? You rarely see them up close, but you feel their presence in the air. They know you exist, though they do not speak of it. Some resent you, others tolerate you, a few even pity you. After all, their positions, though more socially respectable, are also shaped by duty and performance. Perhaps in some twisted way, you and they are not so different, both caught in roles defined by men above you, both measured by appearances rather than freedom. The more you live in this world, the sharper your awareness becomes. You can predict which guest at a symposium will reach for your hand, which rival will try to undermine you, which patron will boast of your presence as if you were another golden cup on his table. It is a constant dance of reading faces, adjusting responses, offering just enough charm without giving away too much of yourself. Can you imagine the exhaustion of always playing a role you cannot step out of? And yet beneath the exhaustion, you begin to recognize something else influence. For all the whispers, for all the dangers, you realize that people change their tone when you are near. Conversations pause when you enter a room. Decisions are softened or hardened, depending on the mood you've created. You may not hold official power, but you hold sway, delicate, fragile, dangerous sway. And that, perhaps, is what makes this life both intoxicating and terrifying at once. They say every grand household is built on appearances, but what they rarely admit is how many shadows live behind those polished doors. The wives, the official women of the house, move through halls like statues of respectability draped in long robes, faces half-hidden, voices soft in public. And yet your very presence unsettles them. Imagine standing in a room where every glance from them feels like a knife wrapped in silk. You're not supposed to exist in their world yet. Here you are, woven into it, like a thread that won't come loose. When the mistress of the house enters the room, changes. Servants straighten, guests rise, and you, though trained to appear invisible, feel her eyes weighing you. She knows exactly who you are, even if she never says your name. She doesn't need to. Her silence is loud enough. Do you wonder how it feels to be both beneath her status and above her reach? She cannot openly challenge you without risking scandal, yet she cannot ignore you either. You are the reminder that her husband's loyalty is divided, that his attentions are not confined to the marital bed. Life in the shadow of wives is a constant balancing act. You are careful with your words, careful with your steps. One wrong smile, one gesture too bold, and whispers begin. The household thrives on whispers. A wife might feign indifference at a banquet, but later her servants gossip in kitchens, planting seeds of doubt. Have you ever been in a place where you felt like every wall had ears? That's what it's like here. Even silence becomes dangerous. There's a story often told in hushed tones about Pericles, the great Athenian statesman. His companion Aspasia, though not a wife in the traditional sense, held influence over him and sparked envy among the respectable women of Athens. People mocked her, accused her, blamed her for political decisions. If a woman like Aspasia, educated, witty, and beloved by one of the most powerful men in Greece, could face such venom, what chance do you, with far less protection, really have? It's a sobering thought, and yet it steals you. You realize that resentment is the price of visibility. Sometimes, though, you glimpse something more complicated in the wife's eyes. Is it only jealousy, or is it recognition? After all, their lives are also shaped by expectation. They are married for alliances, not for love. Their smiles are rehearsed, their movements scrutinized. In a twisted way, you are mirrors of each other, both caught in performances written by someone else's hand. The difference is that their respectability is armor, while yours is a costume. Daily life brings awkward encounters. Passing one another in the courtyard, you bow respectfully, eyes lowered, while she glides past chin high. At meals, you serve wine while she pretends not to notice your presence. And yet, her silence carries weight. Guests read it, servants repeat it, and patrons interpret it. Every action or lack of action feeds the endless cycle of rumor. Isn't it strange how power often lies not in what people say, but in what they refuse to say? Still, there are wives who play the game differently. Some choose to extend kindness, greeting you politely, even protecting you subtly in front of others. Perhaps they know that resistance is useless, so they turn rivalry into coexistence. Others, however, sharpen their disdain like a blade. They dismiss you with cold glances, their servants, mimicking the same cruelty. Those are the days you feel most exposed, when even the slaves carrying water seem emboldened to smirk. It's not just personal, it's political. Marriages among the elite are designed to secure alliances, bind families, and display wealth. A wife's public dignity reflects her husband's status. Your existence, therefore, is a threat to more than just emotions. It's a threat to reputation. And in a society where reputation is everything that makes you a dangerous figure to have under the same roof, and yet you endure. You learn to navigate these unspoken battles with careful grace. You pour wine without trembling bow, without faltering, and laugh at the right moment without overstepping. You discover that survival here is less about beauty than about balancing between envy and acceptance, between silence and presence. It's exhausting, but it teaches you resilience. So you move through the villa like a shadow with polished sandals. Not fully part of the household, not fully outside of it. Always seen, rarely acknowledged. And every time a wife's eyes flicker toward you, full of all the words she cannot say aloud, you are reminded that your life is not just performance, it is intrusion. And it is in that intrusion that your real danger lies. The sun sinks, and with it, the villa transforms. Torches flicker, couches are arranged in a circle, and the wine flows like rivers. This is the symposium, the banquet, the stage where you shift from ornament in the background to centerpiece of entertainment. The clinking of kylixes, the hum of conversation, the strumming of a lyre, it all blends into a blur of ritual. For you every moment, here is a test. Can you charm without overstepping? Can you amuse without being foolish? Can you catch attention without seeming to beg for it? These are the rules of survival beneath the painted ceilings and smoky lamplight. Banquets are where roles collide. Philosophers, poets, generals, and merchants recline on couches, their feet propped on low stools, their minds loosened by wine. They debate politics one moment and laugh at riddles the next. And you, hovering with a jug in hand, are both servant and spectacle. Your movements, how you tilt the jug, how you bow, how your eyes linger, are part of the entertainment. Imagine being a living centerpiece at a dinner party, something between a chandelier and a storyteller. That's your reality now. Then there's music. You pluck the lyre, your fingers trembling only slightly as strings hum across the hall. The melodies are not just notes, they are opportunities. A well-played song draws admiration, sparks conversation, perhaps even wins you a favor from someone powerful. But play too poorly, and the laughter turns sharp. Do you know that feeling when you're called on to perform at school or work, and everyone's eyes lock on you? Multiply that by 10. Add the judgment of men who shape the city's laws, and you'll understand the tension in your shoulders as you strum. And the poetry, oh the poetry. You recite verses of Sappho Archilochus or Anacreon, lines dripping with wit or longing. The audience hums in approval, though sometimes you catch sly glances. They aren't only judging your voice, they're imagining you as the subject of the verse. When a poem speaks of beauty, fleeting like petals in the wind, they smile knowingly as if you were the petal. It's flattering, unsettling, and dangerous all at once. Of course, not every performance is so refined. Some nights descend into rowdiness. A guest too drunk to stand demands you sing louder. Another insists you join in a ridiculous dance. His laughter slurred, his gestures too bold. You oblige, because refusal isn't an option, but inside, you measure every step carefully. One wrong move, and you risk humiliation. One too bold move, and you risk scandal. Banquets, after all, are both playground and battlefield. You remember the story of Alcibiades, famous for barging into a symposium half-drunk, crowned with ivy demanding attention. His beauty and boldness let him get away with antics that would have ruined anyone else. You, however, do not have that luxury. You are not Alcibiades. You cannot afford scandal disguised as charm. For you, survival lies in moderation and knowing how far to bend without breaking. Still, there are moments of levity. Someone cracks a clever joke, the room erupts in laughter, and for a heartbeat, you feel less like an ornament and more like part of the group. The wine tastes sweet, the music flows, and you almost believe you belong. Almost. But then, a rival companion across the hall catches your eye, smirks, and you're reminded this is competition. You are one of many, and everyone wants to be noticed. Outside the villa walls, ordinary Athenians gather in taverns, drinking watered wine, chewing on olives and barley cakes, laughing freely without an audience to impress. Sometimes you envy them. Their meals may be humbler, but their laughter is real. Here, every laugh, every gesture is staged. Isn't it odd how luxury often feels heavier than poverty, yet you endure because you must? The symposium is where reputations are made and destroyed. A single evening can raise you higher or cast you into obscurity. And as the lamps burn low, smoke curling toward the ceiling, you keep your composure pouring, playing, smiling, reciting. A living ornament, yes, but also a survivor, threading your way through the tightrope of admiration and envy. Whispers travel faster than wine, and in a city like Athens, where gossip is as common as olive trees, scandal is always waiting just beyond the courtyard walls. For someone in your position, the danger is not only what you do, but what others say you have done. Imagine standing perfectly still, having done nothing wrong, and yet hearing your name float across the room, carried on voices that smile while they cut. That is the air you breathe every day. Scandal begins in small ways. A guest at a symposium raises an eyebrow at the way your patron's hand lingered too long on your shoulder. A rival companion chuckles as if he knows a secret, and suddenly you are part of a story you never agreed to tell. People thrive on these stories. To them, your life is entertainment, half theater, half cautionary tale. And the cruel truth is, this even silence can become evidence. If you protest too much, they believe the worst. If you say nothing, they invent their own version. How do you win a game where both choices make you lose? History is full of examples where rumors toppled even the mighty. Take the case of Alcibiades, again, not only praised for his beauty and charm, but accused of sacrilege, conspiracy, and betrayal. Some of those accusations were political weapons born in banquets and backrooms rather than in temples. If a man of such power could be destroyed by whispers, what chance does someone like you have? It's a sobering thought that keeps you cautious, every word measured like coins. Scandal is not only external, it festers inside the villa as well. Wives and rivals feed it. A jealous wife seeing her husband's gaze linger too long on you may not confront you directly, but her servants will spread tales in the marketplace. A rival companion might spill wine accidentally on your cloak, then laugh about how you blushed in front of everyone. Each incident, harmless on its own, becomes a piece of evidence in a growing case against you. Do you ever notice how small humiliations sting longer than outright insults? That is the strategy here, death by 1,000 whispers. And yet, the most dangerous scandals are the ones tied to politics. Patrons do not exist in isolation. They are generals, magistrates, philosophers, and merchants with reputations to guard. If a rival faction wants to harm them, you might suddenly find your own name dragged into debates. He is distracted by his companions, they say. He spends more time in banquets than in council. Overnight, you become a symbol of corruption, even if you never lifted a finger. Isn't it strange how invisible people can suddenly become too visible when it suits others? Of course, some lean into the scandal. They joke about it, make themselves larger than life using notoriety as a kind of armor. But you cannot afford that. You live by subtlety, not defiance. When whispers rise, you lower your gaze. When laughter cuts you, let it pass. This restraint is your shield, though it often feels like cowardice. And yet survival is not about pride. It is about endurance. The irony is that scandal keeps you memorable. Patrons and rivals alike remember your name because it is tied to stories true or false. The danger lies in how long those stories linger. A guest who admires you today may turn cold tomorrow because he heard you mocked in the agora. A wife who once tolerated you may sharpen her glare because she believes you've stepped too far. In a world obsessed with appearances, perception is reality, and reality bends easily under the weight of rumor. You start to understand why philosophers like Socrates warned about the dangers of unchecked tongues. Words are heavier than bronze, more piercing than arrows. You've seen it, a single phrase, repeated enough times, becomes fact, no matter how absurd. And your life, already fragile, hangs on that knife edge of perception. But scandal is not always ruin. Sometimes it is distraction. While rivals busy themselves spreading tales about you, they expose their own envy. While wives sharpen rumors into weapons, they reveal their insecurity. And patrons, too clever not to see this, sometimes side with you, precisely because the scandal proves how much attention you command. What is a banquet without gossip, after all? You are both the subject and the spice, the whispered name that keeps tongues wagging. Still, as the night ends and laughter fades, you retreat to your chamber with the weight of it pressing on your chest. You replay conversations, searching for traps you may have stumbled into. You wonder who laughed sincerely and who laughed at you. And you know deep down that tomorrow the stories will continue whether you want them or not. In this life, scandal is not an accident, it is a currency. And whether you like it or not, you are part of the transaction. The hook comes not from laughter or music tonight, but from the quiet clink of jewelry against the table. Payment, gifts, promises, These are the lifelines that decide whether you thrive or whether you fade into obscurity. In this world, beauty alone is never enough. It has to be rewarded, displayed, and supported with tangible proof. A necklace laid across your palm, a silver coin slipped into your pouch, a cloak dyed deep purple. All of these are more than decoration. They are survival itself. You soon realize that every gift carries meaning. A ring is not just a ring, it is a declaration. A cloak is not just fabric, it is a signal. Patrons do not give without expecting something in return. Do you see how dangerous generosity can be? To the outside world, it looks like kindness. To you, it feels like chains. Every time you accept a bracelet or a coin, you are bound a little tighter to the one who gave it. The Greeks understood symbolism, and nothing symbolized possession better than a gift displayed in public. Still, there is comfort in these offerings. After all, the jewelry and coins are not just ornaments, they are shields. When you wear a patron's ring, rivals hesitate before mocking you. When you arrive draped in fine cloth, others know you are under protection. In some ways, gifts are your armor. Without them, you would stand exposed, vulnerable to every whisper. Isn't it curious how metal and fabric so easily broken or stolen can feel like the only defense between you and disgrace? History offers reminders of how gifts defined relationships. Think of Alexander the Great, who bestowed treasures upon his companions, not just out of affection, but to ensure loyalty. The gifts said as much about his power as they did about his favorites. You are no Alexander, of course, but you live in the same logic. When your patron hands you a jeweled clasp or a purse of drachmas, he is saying to the world, "This one belongs to me. This one is worth my treasure." But gifts are fickle. They can be taken back, withheld, or replaced. One day, you recline on cushions, your wrists glittering in lamplight. The next you watch as another companion arrives draped in a new cloak finer than yours. Suddenly, your own treasures feel heavy as if they belonged to yesterday. The danger of living on gifts is that they remind you how temporary favor can be. Have you ever received something so generous that it made you nervous rather than happy? That is the feeling here, joy wrapped in dread. And the coins themselves, they slip through your fingers faster than you'd like. You pay a servant for silence, a vendor for better food, perhaps even a tutor to sharpen your wit. Money keeps the machinery of your life moving, but it never stretches far enough. You notice how quickly it disappears, like water poured onto hot stones. Sometimes you wonder if it is designed that way, to keep you always dependent, never free. There are moments, though, when gifts feel almost tender. A patron pressing a cloak into your hands after you shivered in the night air. A small pouch of coins given quietly, no audience, no boasting, just a gesture that feels more like care than control. Those moments are rare, but they remind you that even in a world of politics and performance, sparks of humanity slip through. The question is, do you let yourself trust them? Or do you remind yourself that even tenderness can be strategy? Outside the villa, people see you pass, adorned in jewelry, your cloak bright, your sandals well made. They whisper about decadence, about softness, about luxury. They don't see the chains hidden in the glitter. They imagine you live an easy life, not realizing that every coin in your pouch is borrowed time. Every bracelet a reminder of how replaceable you truly are. It's almost laughable how the world envies the very things that weigh you down. And yet, for all the danger, for all the dependence, you cling to these tokens. Because without them, you are nothing in this world. The gifts, fragile as they are, keep you afloat. They are proof that you are seen, that you are valued, at least for now. And in a society where invisibility is worse than death, that proof is worth more than gold. So you accept the coins, you wear the jewelry, you smile at the promises whispered in your ear. Because in this life, survival is not about freedom. It is about keeping the gifts flowing, one clasp, one coin, one cloak at a time. The mirror becomes less kind as the years creep forward. Once you woke each morning to find your reflection smooth and luminous, a face that caught every flicker of torchlight, a smile that melted even the coldest eyes. Now lines begin to form, where laughter and tension have carved themselves into your skin. The oils and powders cannot quite hide it, and the whispers shift. Isn't it odd how quickly admiration can turn into calculation, where once they praised your youth, now they measure how much of it remains? Aging out of beauty is the unspoken truth of your role. Everyone knows it, but no one dares to say it aloud in front of you. You feel it in the silence, in the way guests' eyes wander toward someone newer, fresher. You sense it in the patron's pauses, the slower arrival of gifts, the subtle distance. Beauty was always the currency, and currency once devalued cannot be exchanged again. Have you ever clutched something precious in your hand, only to feel it slipping away, no matter how tightly you held on? That is what time feels like now. You watch new faces appear in the villa, young men with brighter eyes, smoother skin, eager laughter. They remind you of yourself, once rehearsing their smiles in polished bronze, adjusting their cloaks nervously before stepping into a room. You want to despise them, but instead you feel a strange mixture of envy and pity. You know the game they are entering. You know how fleeting the applause will be. And yet you also know they will shine for a while longer than you can. This reality is not unique to you. Even legends carried the same burden. Phaedo of Alis, once a boy whose beauty drew patrons, reinvented himself as a philosopher after age dulled his charm. His dialogues, preserved under Plato's name, show how one could escape the prison of appearance by embracing the mind. Perhaps his story offers you a lesson that when the mirror turns cruel, you must find another way to matter. But philosophy is not for everyone. Reinvention takes courage, and not all companions find it. Some fade into obscurity, others turn bitter, clinging to memories of admiration like sailors clutching driftwood. You begin to notice how society values age differently for men of power and men like you. A general grows older and gains gravitas, his scars, and wrinkles proof of wisdom. A statesman's gray hair is admired as a sign of experience. But your value shrinks as your youth fades. Isn't it strange how one man's years become a crown, while another's become a curse that is the cruelty of a system built on appearances? Still, you adapt where you can. You lean into wit, into charm, into knowledge. You recall the debates you overheard in courtyards, the poetry you memorize, the strategies you learned from watching politics unfold around you. Words now become your weapon more than your face. And sometimes, surprisingly, it works. A guest laughs at your clever remark, a patron lingers on your thoughtful observation, and for a moment you feel as though influence can outlive beauty. But it is always a fragile victory, easily undone, when someone younger enters the room with nothing but the glow of youth on their side. There are practical fears as well. Without gifts, without coin, how do you live when admiration fades? Some companions manage to secure long-term patrons, slipping into roles of trusted advisors or household stewards. Others vanish, forced back into the harsh life of ordinary labor, their fine cloaks traded for coarse wool, their hands blistered instead of oiled. You think often about this line, this cliff edge you are approaching. Will you step down gracefully or be pushed? Sometimes, though, there is peace in honesty. In quiet moments, when no one is watching, you admit to yourself that you cannot hold back time. You look at the younger ones and almost want to warn them, enjoy it while it lasts. The applause always fades, but you never say it. Instead, you nod politely. You smile with the remnants of your old charm, and you accept that the stage you once commanded now belongs to someone else. And yet, even as the mirror grows harsher, there remains one truth. You have lived inside marble halls, worn fabrics finer than most will ever touch, spoken words that shaped decisions, heard laughter directed at you across banquets where the city's rulers reclined. You may not be young forever, but the memories remain. Perhaps that is the quiet consolation that even as your beauty fades, your survival itself becomes its own kind of triumph. Your face may fade from memory, but art and words have a way of leaving echoes long after you yourself have stepped into silence. In Greece, poets were the record keepers of feeling, and sculptors the record keepers of form. Sometimes you catch fragments of yourself, or at least of your kind, hidden in their work. A verse about fleeting beauty, a vase painting of a reclining youth at a symposium, a marble bust whose smooth cheeks could have been yours once. You're not named, of course. Names rarely survive for those in your position, but the outlines remain immortalized without credit. Isn't it strange to see shadows of yourself celebrated while your real life is forgotten? You think of Anacreon, the poet who sang endlessly of love wine and young companions. His verses are filled with laughter, flirtation, longing. To the audience, it's entertainment. To you, it's recognition. He might never have seen your face, but his words describe your world too well. The careful smile, the lingering glance, the precarious dance between admiration and danger. Even as history mocks or forgets, poetry preserves the feeling. And feelings, you realize, outlive names. But not every echo is flattering. Satirists take aim at companions like you, turning you into punchlines. They paint you as frivolous, shallow, greedy, a caricature easier to mock than to understand. You overhear these jokes sometimes told by men who sip wine you poured for them, who smile at you in private, but sneer in public. It stings, though you learn to wear indifference like armor. After all, isn't it easier to laugh at what you cannot control? Sculpture and painting tell similar half-truths. On painted kylixes, youths recline gracefully beside older men, the scene frozen in idealized balance. The reality, the tension, the rivalry, the fear of scandal is erased. You know that what survives on pottery is only the polished version stripped of the shadows. You're preserved as ornament, not as human. How many centuries will look at those images and see only elegance, never the exhaustion that lived beneath it? Even philosophers contribute to your ghostly afterlife. Plato, in his Symposium, turned relationships like yours into metaphors for the pursuit of beauty and truth. A flattering disguise, perhaps, but still a disguise. He wasn't writing about you. He was using you as a symbol, a stepping stone to higher ideas. It's flattering in one way to be linked to philosophy itself. Yet also ironic, isn't it, that your lived struggles become mere allegories for someone else's thought experiments? You wonder how memory works. Will people centuries from now Look at vase paintings of reclining youths and think you lived a life of ease, never realizing the weight of envy and suspicion that followed you. Will they read verses and imagine endless pleasure, never hearing the silence of your aging years? It's almost comical. History loves beauty, but rarely cares about the cost of it. Still, there is a kind of power in leaving traces, even anonymous ones. Think of how many nameless figures fill Greek art, the workers on friezes, the dancers etched into pottery, the companions half hidden in poetry. They may not be named, but they are remembered in some form forever. You too slip into that category. Invisible to history books, yet visible to eyes that study statues and verses centuries later. Isn't that in its own way survival? And survival has always been your quiet triumph. Even when rivals whispered, even when wives glared, even when the mirror turned cruel, you endured. Now your endurance itself becomes part of the cultural memory. You may not be Alcibiades immortalized for politics and scandal, but you linger in subtler ways. The curve of a cheek in marble, the subject of a love song, the butt of a satirical joke. The nameless figure scholars point to and say, here is what life was like. There is irony in this. You lived every day balancing admiration and danger, yet history smooths it all into elegance. Perhaps that's the final joke your struggles edited out, so others can admire the surface. And yet, as you sit with this thought, you realize it doesn't matter. You are remembered even if distorted. You are still part of the story. And for someone who was always half visible, half hidden, maybe that is the most fitting afterlife of all. The quiet comes at last. No more banquets echoing with laughter. No more courtyards buzzing with liars. No more glances sharp as knives from wives who never spoke your name. The stage has dimmed, and you step into silence, not with applause, but with the soft weight of being forgotten. And yet in that stillness, something unexpected stirs, a release, a loosening of chains that once glittered like jewelry. You are no longer the jewel on a patron's arm, no longer the whispered scandal of a symposium. Instead, you walk the same streets as fishermen and merchants, blending into the ordinary rhythm of the city. For the first time in years, no one stops to study the tilt of your smile or the drape of your cloak. At first, it feels like loss, but then you realize it is also freedom. Isn't it strange how the absence of attention, once terrifying, can eventually feel like peace? You begin to rebuild in quiet ways. Perhaps you become a tutor, teaching a boy his first verses of Homer. Perhaps you keep the accounts for a small household, your sharp memory now put to practical use. The skills you once thought of as ornaments, listening closely, speaking carefully, reading moods, become tools for survival in this new chapter. They are no longer performances, but simply parts of who you are. And though the roles may seem smaller, they carry a stability the banquet halls never offered. Still, memories cling. Passing a courtyard, you hear a liar's notes and are carried back to nights of applause. Seeing a young companion at a symposium, shoulders straight and eyes bright, you recognize the same mixture of fear and hope you once carried. You feel envy, yes, but also pity, because you know how fragile the glow of youth truly is. You do not say anything. You simply watch silently, acknowledging the cycle that never ends. History does not carve your name in stone. You will not be remembered alongside generals or philosophers, but in art and verse shadows of your life linger. A figure painted on pottery, reclining at a symposium. A poem about fleeting beauty. A half-forgotten anecdote in a satirist's play. You exist there, half visible, half hidden. And perhaps that is fitting, for weren't you always living in between both ornament and human admired, and dismissed central and invisible all at once? You find pride and endurance. For all the gossip, for all the fading looks you survived, you stepped through rooms filled with envy, jealousy, admiration, and power, and you are still here. That in itself is a legacy. Others may have been crushed by scandal, destroyed by envy, or discarded without a trace. You at least carry your story with you, even if the world never writes it down. Isn't survival, after all, its own form of triumph? And perhaps you are remembered more than you know. Centuries later, a visitor in a museum will pause before a vase showing a reclining youth and ask, who were they really? They will never know your name, but they will wonder. That wondering is a kind of immortality. You live in questions as much as in answers. So the long quiet after is not emptiness, it is release. You are no longer bound to smiles rehearsed in bronze mirrors, no longer trapped in the delicate web of gifts and whispers. You are simply human again, unremarkable, perhaps, but free. And that freedom lies the final truth. Even in silence, you remain part of the story, a shadow etched into history's edges, a reminder that beauty fades, but endurance endures. You followed the quiet footsteps of a male companion through marble halls, learning how survival depended on beauty, wit, and silence. But while his life was shaped by performance and politics, another story unfolded in the same society, far darker, far harsher. For women born into slavery, there were no fine cloaks, no silver bracelets, no chance to hide behind charm. Their bodies were labor, their lives were property, and the brutal routines they endured were accepted as ordinary. If the companion lived as an ornament, the enslaved woman lived as a tool, and her reality was far more horrific. You wake up not to a sunrise of liberty, but to the heavy knowledge that freedom was never in your cards. The hook here is brutal, yet simple. Some women in ancient Greece never had the luxury of losing their freedom because they were born without it in the first place. Imagine that. No single moment of capture, no dramatic chain clinking at a marketplace, just the reality that from the very first cry you let out, you were already marked as property. It is the kind of start to life that makes you wonder, did hope ever even have room to breathe? You trudge through your earliest days, not as a daughter celebrated with olive wreaths or playful songs, but as an asset. In households across Athens, Corinth, or Sparta, a girl born to an enslaved mother was automatically enslaved herself. The law was clear. Your bloodline sealed your fate. No matter who your father was, whether a free man or another enslaved worker, the child's future followed the mother. This wasn't seen as cruelty in their eyes. It was practicality, a neat bureaucratic trick to ensure the system renewed itself without the need for constant war raids or fresh purchases. Can you imagine being classified not by who you were, but by who your mother had been? In a strange twist, enslaved children sometimes grew up in the very same households where free children ran about with toys, lessons, and laughter. You, as the enslaved girl, might even share the same nursery as the master's daughter, yet your futures forked before either of you could form a sentence. She would grow into silks betrothals and public parades. You would grow into linen aprons, command-barking mistresses, and the silent endurance of daily chores. Have you ever noticed how two people can be raised in the same environment, yet life hands them entirely different scripts? This was that dynamic except the lines were drawn not by effort or talent, but by unbreakable law. The funny thing about the Greeks, they loved to brag about their democracy, their philosophy, their clever plays, and symposium debates. Yet democracy never extended to the enslaved. You could overhear men in the household arguing about justice or the rights of citizens sipping watered wine while quoting Socrates, and none of it applied to you. It's like being in the same room where people invent the concept of fairness and you're not even considered part of the species it belongs to. Picture yourself as a child playing in the courtyard, tasked with small duties like sweeping dust or fetching water, while overhearing grand discussions about virtue. Philosophers like Aristotle even wrote about people like you, insisting some humans were natural slaves. A bold claim, isn't it convenient too, for those benefiting from your labor? It is almost comical. In its hypocrisy, the same man who dissected ethics with a surgeon's precision also justified why you, the little girl holding the clay pot, would never taste freedom. Doesn't it feel eerily similar to modern times, when leaders preach equality while designing loopholes to exclude the very people they claim to protect? Your earliest memories would be soaked in servitude. For example, while free-born children might learn to read Homer's epics or practice the lyre, your training was in how to serve bread without dropping crumbs, or how to clean oil lamps without smudging the bronze. These weren't innocent chores for pocket money. They were survival skills. One mistake meant a scolding, sometimes worse. It's like growing up in a school where the only subject is obedience and the punishment for failing is humiliation. How many of us would have passed those lessons? The divide also reached into play. Free children's games might include mock battles or playful races. Yours were limited to moments snatched in shadows, laughing quietly with other enslaved children when no one noticed. Can you picture the imbalance? A noble boy pretends to be Achilles, wielding a wooden sword, while you and your friends pretend to be what heroes weren't meant for you. Even pretend was a luxury, and when caught play could be turned into evidence of idleness. And then there were the stories told about your kind. You weren't celebrated in myths as queens or goddesses. Female slaves appeared in Greek plays mostly as background, often nameless, sometimes tragic, rarely triumphant. Aristophanes and Euripides crafted elaborate tales of free-born heroes, but the enslaved woman. At best, she was comic relief. At worst, a cautionary figure. To live in a culture where even fiction erases your dignity, that's a theft no less cruel than the loss of liberty itself. Modern parallels aren't hard to spot. Think of children born into generational poverty today. The cycle feels unbreakable, the rules stacked against them before they even lace up their first shoes. You might know someone, or maybe you've seen it in headlines, who never had the chance to choose their path because circumstance already chose it. Ancient Greece perfected that kind of systemic lock. For enslaved girls, being born wasn't a new beginning. It was a continuation of someone else's bondage. And let's not forget, there was always a layer of irony baked into it. Some wealthy Athenians claimed they kept enslaved people for efficiency, freeing themselves for higher pursuits like philosophy, art, or politics. Imagine being told your whole purpose in life was to scrub their floors so they could sit around arguing about the meaning of happiness. It's almost laughable if it weren't so grim. Wouldn't you agree? The privilege of pondering happiness sounds hollow when built on the backs of those never allowed to pursue it. Life born into bondage meant you didn't even have a memory of freedom to cling to. A war captive could at least in thought recall her past village, her family, her old routines. But you never had that before and after. No line dividing before slavery and after slavery. Just one long, unbroken after. And so, when someone later asked, "Do you remember your childhood?" what would you say? That you remember the feel of clay under your hands, the sound of your mistress's commands, the taste of watered-down bread. Childhood itself was colonized by servitude. Which brings us to the next stage in your journey. If being born enslaved was the starting line, then the marketplace was the stage where your reality was made even more visible. For some, it came later when households had too many servants or debts needed to be paid off. And there in broad daylight, your very body became merchandise under the gaze of strangers. You find yourself standing on a platform, not as a guest or spectator, but as the display. The air smells of sweat olives, and dust a mixture of everyday Greek life and the uneasy tension of commerce. The market isn't just for amphorae of wine or baskets of figs, it's also for you. The slave market was as normal in Athens or Corinth as a Saturday farmer's market might feel to us today, except instead of sampling honey or haggling for cheese. People came to inspect the living bodies that would soon be folded into their households. The spectacle begins with stripping. Clothes, even the simplest tunic, were taken away because buyers wanted to see what they were paying for. Privacy, dignity. Those concepts didn't apply here. Women were stood in front of strangers, forced to rotate to lift arms to expose scars or signs of strength. It was a parade of humiliation disguised as practical business. Have you ever gone shopping for fruit and seen people poke and prod for bruises? Now imagine being treated the same way, except you are not fruit, you are a person. Buyers leaned close, tugging at your hair to test its thickness, checking your teeth for health, even pressing against your muscles to judge stamina. If you looked fragile, the price dropped. If you looked strong enough to grind grain all day, the price rose. And if your face or body hinted at attractiveness, another calculation entered not just labor, but private service. You were a purchase with multiple potential functions. Can you imagine the pressure of being assessed like a tool at a hardware store, every glance reducing you to features men conducted, the sales loudly calling out attributes as if you were a fine horse, good worker, strong arms, no signs of sickness. The auctioneer might exaggerate or gloss over flaws, and the crowd might laugh or bargain as though it were entertainment. It's unsettling, isn't it? How quickly something horrific becomes routine once normalized. Just as today, people scroll online, rating products with stars. These buyers rated lives by price tags. The setting was public. Citizens could pass by, children could watch, travelers could pause to gawk. Female slaves weren't hidden away in discreet transactions. They were openly sold, reinforcing their low status. Think of how unsettling it would be if in the middle of a bustling street market today, people were displayed on platforms inspected by strangers with coins jingling in their hands. That's the level of normalization we're talking about. Some accounts describe potential buyers asking slaves to perform small tasks, lift a jug walk across the platform to show ability. A woman might be asked to kneel or bend, not just to test flexibility, but to reinforce the power dynamic. And of course, you couldn't protest. To speak out of turn risked punishment, to resist was impossible. So silence became its own kind of uniform, worn just as plainly as the plain cloth draped across you. Occasionally, a wealthy patron might send a trusted agent to the market looking for particular qualities. A matron might want a nurse for her children. A merchant might want weavers for his workshop. Or a soldier returning from campaign might simply want another set of hands. Every request was transactional, every woman reduced to a line item. Even young girls weren't exempt. Imagine standing beside your mother, both of you sold at once perhaps to separate households. One auctioneer's hammer split entire families without hesitation. There's an almost theatrical cruelty to it. The crowd, the raised platform, the call and response of bids, it resembled theater, except no one on stage volunteered for the role. Greek theater celebrated tragedy, yet here was real tragedy unfolding daily in open-air squares. Do you see the irony? The same culture that applauded Sophocles' plays about fate and suffering casually enacted fate and suffering in the marketplace. And then came the final blow. Branding was sometimes added after the sale. To mark ownership, some enslaved people were burned with small insignias like livestock. Not every region or master did this. The fact that it existed at all speaks volumes. Ownership wasn't just written on papyrus contracts, it was seared into the skin. If you've ever had a small burn scar, you know how long it lingers. Now imagine that scar is deliberate, permanent, and symbolic of your reduced humanity. The sale ended with coins exchanging hands, buyers congratulating themselves, and you led away chained or bound with rope. No farewell, no second chances. Just another transaction concluded. To the crowd, it was business as usual. To you, it was the complete erasure of any sense of autonomy. It's chilling, isn't it? How commerce can strip away humanity so efficiently. Now picture the walk from the market to your new household. The streets are noisy with chatter and cartwheels, but you hear little of it. Every turn takes you farther from familiarity, deeper into servitude. And as you enter the threshold of your new master's home, the next chapter of your life begins not as a free woman, not even as a market curiosity anymore, but as the permanent worker in someone else's daily routine. The house you enter is not a palace, but it might as well feel like one when your position is always on the lowest rung. The doorway swallows you into a courtyard surrounded by tiled roofs, columns, and busy chatter. For the mistress of the house, this is her kingdom. For you, it is the cage where dawn and dusk blur together in labor. Household drudgery doesn't sound dramatic, does it? But it's the grindstone on which enslaved women's lives were slowly worn down day after day. From the moment the first rooster crows, you're awake. Not because you want to be, but because the household expects you to be. The tasks begin with grinding grain into flour, a monotonous, back-breaking duty. You kneel before a heavy stone quern, moving it in circles until your shoulders burn, producing enough flour for bread that others will eat without ever thinking about the labor behind it. Ever made bread at home today with an electric mixer and felt tired after 5 minutes? Imagine grinding by hand for hours before breakfast even begins. Water must be fetched next, and wells aren't conveniently placed in the kitchen. You walk with clay jars balanced against your hips, trudging back and forth until your muscles ache. Sometimes it isn't just the household that needs water, the animals do too. So you carry poor Carrie again. How many trips does it take to quench a family, their servants, and their livestock? Too many, and none of it excuses you from the other chores still waiting. Laundry isn't like tossing clothes into a machine. It's hauling garments to streams or cisterns, scrubbing them against stones, then dragging them back to dry. Soap, as we know it, wasn't common. Instead, you might use lye or even clay rough on both fabric and skin. Your hands stay red, cracked, and swollen, a visible marker of endless scrubbing. And while you labor, your mistress might stroll by adjusting her jewelry, commenting idly on how well or poorly you do the work. Doesn't it sting when someone critiques effort they would never survive themselves? The kitchen is another battlefield. Fires must be tended, pots stirred, bread baked in clay ovens that radiate choking heat. You slice vegetables, roast meats, and prepare wine mixtures, all the while ensuring meals are ready on time. Imagine the tension one late dish could mean: a sharp word, a slap, or worse. Meals weren't just about food. They were displays of wealth and order, and you were the invisible gear making the display function. Cleaning extends beyond the hearth. Floors must be swept, lamps refilled with oil, couches polished, walls wiped down. In a culture that prized appearances, dirt was an insult to status. So you scrubbed, polished, and dusted endlessly, not because you cared about marble floors shining, but because your survival depended on them shining. Have you ever cleaned up after a party you didn't even attend? Multiply that by years, and you get the rhythm of an enslaved woman's life. Sometimes you also became the caretaker. Children in the house needed watching, feeding, bathing. Infants often nursed by enslaved women if the mistress preferred not to herself. In this way, enslaved women provided intimate care for the very children who would grow up to inherit authority over them. Isn't that a peculiar cruelty to raise someone who will later command you? You wipe their noses, sing them to sleep, and years later, they bark orders as though you were always beneath them. And yet, despite being essential, your presence was treated as invisible. Free men and women barely acknowledged the countless tasks slaves performed. Philosophers debated the structure of the household, but rarely paused to note who physically held it together. The word oikates, household slave, covered a multitude of roles, but behind it were real bodies bent over endless labor. How many people today complain about chores, forgetting that in the past, those chores were a lifetime sentence? The drudgery wasn't just physical, it was psychological. You lived in someone else's space, but never belonged to it. The walls you scrubbed weren't your walls. The meals you cooked weren't your meals. The beds you prepared weren't yours to rest in. Every task reminded you that life belonged to others. Think about that. Every act of labor became a mirror reflecting your lack of ownership. And the hierarchy within the enslaved made it worse. Some women were favored, perhaps managing others or serving directly in the mistress's chambers, while others stayed at the bottom doing the dirtiest tasks. Rivalries and resentments brewed because favoritism determined who got slightly less miserable duties. But even the lucky ones remained property. No amount of skill or reliability erased that fact. The rhythm of household work left little time to think, but sometimes in those rare, quiet moments, while waiting for dough to rise, or when the house fell silent, you might wonder, was this it? Would the rest of your life be one long chain of chores, punctuated only by punishment or exhaustion? The silence could be as heavy as the labor itself. And yet, just when you thought the drudgery was the worst part, reality shifted. Because in ancient Greece, a female slave's body wasn't just for labor, it was also considered part of the household property in a far more personal, invasive way. In ancient Greece, your body wasn't just expected to work. It was claimed, owned, and treated as part of the household inventory. If grinding grain wore down your muscles, and scrubbing floors tore up your hands, this truth cut deeper. Your very self was never considered your own. To the people who ruled over you, a female slave was not just labor, but also property to be accessed, commanded, and controlled at will. The Greeks didn't veil this in secrecy. Legal codes and social customs left no room for the idea of consent. Your body was written into the same ledger that listed household cattle, silverware, and farmland. Philosophers, who wrote about justice and virtue, rarely hesitated to accept that enslaved women were simply part of the natural order. Can you imagine how crushing it must have been to hear Aristotle describe some people as natural slaves, while you stood only a few rooms away, holding a water jug in silence? The household was where this reality showed itself most clearly. Within those walls, your chores blurred with the unspoken expectation that you were always available. A master could summon you a mistress, could arrange your unions with other slaves for convenience, and your own wishes never entered the calculation. It wasn't a matter of whether you wanted something, it was whether the household required it. Even moments of rest weren't yours. The very space you occupied was borrowed conditional on obedience. Think of the Greek symposium, those drinking parties where men gathered to debate politics and poetry. For them, it was an intellectual feast. For enslaved women, it meant pouring wine, keeping cups filled, and often serving far beyond what the title of attendant implied. Imagine the strangeness of hearing men debate the meaning of freedom over goblets you had just filled, while knowing you would never taste a drop of that liberty yourself. Doesn't that contradiction make the word freedom feel like a bitter joke? Mistresses, too, wielded this authority. They could decide who among the enslaved women would nurse their children, sometimes forcing women to give their own milk to infants who would one day inherit power over them. Some were paired with male slaves for breeding the children, guaranteed as more property for the household. Imagine standing by as your own daughter takes her first steps knowing she is already written into a life of service. There was no fresh start for her, only the continuation of chains. The cruelty became sharper when dressed in normalcy. A mistress asking you to share a bed with another servant might sound like an order of routine domestic arrangement, but beneath it was the complete erasure of your right to choose even your most private bonds. Commands like these weren't framed as cruelty. They were framed as practicality. And that practicality turned into one of the quietest, most destructive tools of oppression. Greek literature reflects this normalization. In comedies, enslaved women sometimes appeared as figures of ridicule, a passing joke for the audience. In tragedies, they might appear as background characters, tragic but never central. Society laughed or wept around their existence, but rarely for them. And when the audience accepts laughter at suffering, resistance becomes nearly impossible. Have you ever noticed how humor can disguise cruelty, making people nod along without realizing what they're endorsing? The silence around enslaved women's bodies was perhaps the heaviest weight. They couldn't appeal to courts. They couldn't speak out. And even if they confided in one another, it was always under the shadow of punishment. That's why history records so little of their voices. Their lives were present everywhere in Greek society, raising children, cleaning homes, pouring wine, but their words rarely made it onto the page. The absence is telling. It reminds us that silence, too, can be imposed like a chain. And so when people today admire the gleaming marble statues of Greek goddesses, it's worth pausing to remember the living women who scrubbed those marble floors without recognition. Their hands polished the beauty others admired, even as their own lives were deemed unworthy of dignity. From here, the story continues, not with relief, but with repetition. Because when enslaved women bore children, those children were not born into hope. They were born directly into the same system, marked from birth, as property, ensuring the cycle would never break. If you thought the weight of servitude ended with you, ancient Greece had another layer of cruelty prepared your children. By law, every child born to an enslaved mother was enslaved too, no matter who the father was. Freedom never flowed through bloodlines. It was blocked at the root. Imagine holding your newborn in your arms, marveling at the tiny fingers and the way their eyes blink against the light, only to know their fate is already sealed before they can even crawl. That first cry wasn't a declaration of life. It was the quiet sound of chains being fastened for another generation. The Greeks didn't consider this tragic. They considered it efficient. To them, it ensured the system replenished itself naturally, like crops reseeding each season. A household could grow its own workforce by letting its enslaved women bear children. It's unsettling, isn't it, how something as sacred as motherhood could be twisted into a practical economic strategy. You weren't just raising a baby. You were raising the master's next laborer, nursemaid, or servant. And here's the sharpest twist: the father's identity didn't matter. Even if the father was free, the child inherited the mother's status. The womb became the system's insurance policy, guaranteeing future generations of servitude. Can you imagine the bitterness of knowing that even if your child had noble blood, society would still stamp them with the label of slave? That rule cut across all hopes, making it impossible to dream of escape through lineage. The practical consequences filled every corner of daily life. Little boys born in chains might grow into field hands, or artisans their work, enriching households that never saw them as more than tools. Little girls were raised with the same burdens their mothers carried, grinding grain, fetching water, waiting on freeborn children. Entire family trees sprouted within walls that were never their own. To call it generational captivity feels almost too polite. It was more like a garden carefully tended for someone else's harvest. Consider the psychological weight. As a mother, you poured everything into your child's survival, feeding them, nursing them, soothing them through fevers, yet you knew they would never truly belong to you. At any moment, the master could decide to sell your son or daughter at the market. And just like that, your family could be scattered with no hope of reunion. How do you parent a child under the constant threat of loss? Do you dare to love fully, or do you hold back, knowing attachment could be ripped away in an instant? History leaves us faint echoes of these realities. In Xenophon's writings, we glimpse references to children raised within households, often unnamed and uncounted, treated as background to the lives of freeborn heirs. Archaeological remains sometimes reveal enslaved children buried near estates, often without the elaborate rites granted to freeborn families. These traces remind us that behind the polished philosophy of Greek thinkers, there were mothers kneeling at graves for children whose lives had been short, brutal, and invisible. Even the act of child-rearing became an extension of service. Enslaved mothers often had to nurse not only their own infants, but also the children of their mistresses. Imagine the contradiction: your own baby crying from hunger, while you were ordered to feed another woman's child first. It wasn't simply unfair. It was a deliberate reminder that your body and your family were never your own. Doesn't that make the concept of household harmony sound hollow when built on such sacrifices? And still, the cycle rolled on. Those children grew up alongside the freeborn, sometimes even playing together as toddlers. But the divide appeared quickly. The freeborn child was taught letters, songs, and myths of gods. Your child was taught obedience, silence, and labor. They might laugh together in youth, but by adolescence one was reciting Homer and the other was scrubbing floors. The fork in their paths wasn't earned, it was legislated. Think of the modern world's debates about breaking cycles of poverty. Even today, children are often trapped in circumstances not of their choosing. The Greek system perfected that cycle centuries ago, hardwiring it into law. A mother's shackles became a child's inheritance with no chance for redemption except through the rare mercy of manumission. And even that was so unlikely it felt more like myth than hope. So when you hear about the brilliance of Greek democracy, the triumphs of Athens, the legacy of philosophy and art, remember that in the quiet corners of those households, enslaved mothers raised children who never had a future to claim. Their lullabies weren't songs of hope, but of endurance. And the most haunting thought is this: for those women giving birth didn't mean creating a new beginning. It meant watching the cycle start again. Humiliation, however, wasn't locked inside the home. The city streets themselves became another arena where enslaved women were reminded daily that their status could never be hidden. Step outside the house, and the chains become even more visible. In the marketplace, at the fountains, even during festivals, your status followed you like a shadow that never let you breathe. Public humiliation was not an accident. It was part of the design. To the Greeks, enslaved women needed constant reminders of where they stood, and those reminders were stitched right into the fabric of daily life. One of the most obvious signs was appearance. Unlike free women, who could drape themselves in fine peploy and jewelry, enslaved women were often kept in plain coarse clothing, sometimes half-clothed, or with visible marks of servitude. It wasn't just about practicality, it was about stripping away dignity. A ragged tunic told the world you weren't free. It's a little like how modern uniforms can label a person's role instantly, but here the uniform was chosen. It was imposed as a badge of inferiority. Chains and collars added to the spectacle. Not every slave wore them daily, but when punishment or intimidation was needed, iron restraints became part of the outfit. Some were engraved with messages like, "Catch me," "I am a runaway," meant to shame as well as restrain. Imagine walking through the Agora, the busy Greek square, with those words literally hanging around your neck. Everyone could read your humiliation before you even spoke. Doesn't it remind you of how society sometimes still labels people, publicly turning private suffering into spectacle festivals, ironically amplified the contrast? Free women joined processions carrying offerings to the gods, their movements a display of civic pride. Enslaved women trailed behind with baskets, tools, or burdens on their backs. You were part of the same parade, but in a different register, your presence emphasized someone else's glory. Have you ever been in a group photo where you were shoved to the side unacknowledged? Multiply that feeling by a lifetime, and you get the essence of Greek festivals for enslaved women. Wells and fountains were another stage for humiliation. Water gathering was a task assigned to slaves, and in public fountains, the hierarchy was obvious. Free women might stand chatting while their jars were filled by attendants, while enslaved women waited in line balancing heavy amphorae, their status exposed by clothing and calloused hands. The fountain, a symbol of shared civic life, became instead a daily reminder of division. Even the simple act of carrying water could announce your chains to every passerby. Punishments, too, were sometimes inflicted publicly, deliberately designed to shame. A disobedient woman might be flogged in view of others, not only to hurt her, but to warn anyone watching. Greek comedies even joked about such beatings, turning them into punchlines. The audience laughed, but the enslaved lived the reality. Doesn't it sting to realize how easily cruelty becomes entertainment when you're not the one enduring it? Aristophanes, for instance, slipped scenes into his plays where slaves were beaten or mocked, and the crowd roared with laughter. Those moments weren't fiction to you. They mirrored daily life. Imagine sitting in the wings, hearing people cheer at caricatures of your suffering, knowing the same crowd would jeer at you if they saw you walking home. The humiliation extended beyond the act itself. It was reinforced by culture, comedy, and art. Even temples were not safe. Though sanctuaries were supposed to be places of divine equality, enslaved women still carried burdens into sacred spaces. They might clean floors, prepare offerings, or assist priests, yet they were never considered true worshippers. Standing at the altar didn't erase the marks of servitude. Instead, it emphasized that even before the gods, society dictated your worth. It's haunting, isn't it, to think of someone scrubbing a temple's marble steps while prayers for justice echoed above them. The paradox of visibility shaped everything. You were constantly on display, yet never acknowledged as a person. Everyone saw you, your labor, your suffering, your presence in festivals and markets, but no one recognized your humanity. That kind of humiliation doesn't just hurt in the moment. It chips away at your very sense of self. And yet you endured, because endurance was the only form of resistance that didn't invite immediate punishment. This constant visibility set the stage for another layer of servitude. For some enslaved women, their degradation didn't even end in the household or the streets. Some were bound to temples themselves, dedicated as offerings to the gods, trapped in a different kind of servitude that wore the mask of piety. In the sacred heart of the city, where marble columns reached for the sky and incense curled into the air, you might think a temple meant sanctuary. But for some enslaved women, temples were simply another prison, one wrapped in holiness. Being handed over to a god sounded lofty in words, yet in practice it meant years, sometimes a lifetime of servitude under the name of piety. The hook here is sharp. Even the gods were used as an excuse to chain women tighter. Families sometimes dedicated female slaves to sanctuaries as offerings, believing it brought divine favor. On the surface, this looked like generosity, a gift to the gods. But for the woman involved, it was another form of being transferred like property. You didn't walk into the temple as a free worshiper. You were led in as a permanent worker, stripped of the last illusion that religion might protect you. Have you ever noticed how often systems of power dress up control as devotion? Temple slavery varied depending on the cult. In some sanctuaries, women were assigned to clean sacred precincts, polish altars, weave ceremonial garments, or prepare sacrifices. The work was endless, repetitive, and held under the constant gaze of priests. What sounded like holy service was in reality a schedule of grinding chores, just like the household, only now under the eye of the divine. And then there was the weight of symbolism. Being labeled sacred didn't elevate you. It fixed your status more firmly. Free women could leave the temple after a festival, return to their homes, and recount their devotion with pride. You remained behind, unseen, laboring long after the songs faded. Isn't it ironic? The same rituals that claimed to honor gods of justice and protection were built on the backs of women who had no justice and no protection. Some temples demanded women weave elaborate textiles for the gods' statues. This was no casual embroidery circle. These cloths could take months, even years, and required precision under supervision. Each stitch was another reminder that your hands belonged to others. The finished garment was paraded in ceremonies admired by citizens, while no one applauded the enslaved seamstresses whose eyes blurred and fingers bled. The most haunting part was how temples blurred the line between faith and exploitation. To outsiders, you looked privileged, a woman chosen to serve the god. But from inside, you knew it was just another transfer of ownership. And because religion carried divine weight, there was no questioning it. How do you protest when your chains are declared holy? Doesn't that make them even harder to resist? Historical fragments give us glimpses. In Delphi and Dodona, inscriptions record names of women dedicated to sanctuaries, often with notes about who donated them. Those inscriptions celebrate the donor, not the woman herself. Her name appears only as proof of someone else's devotion. It's chilling to see faith and ownership carved together in stone side by side. Even sacred prostitution, whispered about in certain cults, carried this same theme. Though details are debated, what matters is the consistency. Women's bodies were framed as tools for ritual controlled under the mask of religion. Whether weaving cloth, preparing sacrifices, or serving in other ways, the message was the same. You existed for the god's household, never your own. And while temples offered grandeur to citizens, towering statues, golden offerings, hymns that echoed through the columns, you lived in the back rooms, sweeping, cooking, and mending. The public saw the glitter. You bore the grind. Think of how modern monuments often shine while the laborers who built them remain anonymous. The parallel is hard to miss. The irony: Greeks adored their myths of goddesses: Athena, the wise; Artemis, the pure; Aphrodite, the beautiful. Statues of powerful women dotted the city, inspiring awe. Yet living women enslaved in temples found no reflection of that glory. Their service honored marble goddesses, while denying flesh and blood women any hint of dignity. Doesn't that hypocrisy feel louder than the temple bells themselves? And as if sacred bondage wasn't enough, punishment was always waiting around the corner. A woman who faltered in her duties, whether in the temple or the home, faced brutal methods of correction. The next part of the story leads not to holiness, but to the iron fist of discipline. Discipline in ancient Greece was not whispered behind closed doors. It was written into the daily rhythm of slavery. For enslaved women, mistakes, disobedience, or even imagined slights often brought punishment that was swift, public, and brutal. If the household demanded obedience, violence was the tool that enforced it. The Greeks might have painted vases with graceful dancers and sculpted gods in perfect marble, but behind those images lay an uglier truth. Whips, brands, and fear were as normal as olive oil and bread. Beatings were the most common punishment. A wrong word, a slow task, or a dropped jug could bring lashes across the back or legs. Tools varied: sticks, whips, or ropes twisted into cords. But the purpose was the same: pain, to remind you of your place. Philosophers even wrote casually about it, suggesting slaves required fear as motivation. Can you imagine being considered so unworthy of respect that pain was described as your natural language? It's a thought that still echoes uncomfortably today, whenever punishment is used instead of compassion. Branding was another horror, marking the body like cattle. a hot iron pressed against the skin, left scars that shouted ownership to anyone who saw. Sometimes these brands carried symbols, letters, or warnings about running away. Picture the humiliation, your body literally advertising your captivity with every step you took. Modern society would call this dehumanizing, but to the Greeks, it was efficient bookkeeping, ensuring you were never mistaken for free. Doesn't it sting to realize that bureaucracy once burned itself onto living flesh? Restraints were common as well. Iron collars, heavy chains, and shackles could be clamped on for days or weeks. Some collars bore inscriptions like a living tag, warning others not to aid escape. Imagine walking through crowded streets with metal around your neck, the clinking echoing your shame. Even silence couldn't hide your status. The chains spoke for you. Public humiliation overlapped with punishment. A woman accused of disobedience might be paraded through the agora, tied or beaten in front of crowds. The spectacle wasn't only for her correction, it was a warning to others. In a society that valued order above fairness, punishment became theater, and enslaved women were forced into the role of unwilling actors. Doesn't that sound uncomfortably close to how some modern systems still use public shaming as control? Psychological punishment ran alongside the physical. Threats of being sold to harsher households or sent to labor camps kept fear alive. For women, the threat often included being separated from children, knowing one wrong move could mean never seeing them again. Sometimes the threat alone was enough to keep obedience rigid, because the imagination often paints worse torments than reality. Greek comedies disturbingly turned these punishments into jokes. Playwrights wrote scenes of slaves being beaten, and audiences laughed. To them, it was slapstick. To you, it was daily life. The laughter of the crowd didn't erase the bruises. It only reinforced how normalized cruelty had become. Isn't it chilling how humor can make chains seem invisible? The cruelest irony was that the very tools of punishment were often maintained by slaves themselves. Women had to wash blood from whips carried chains, or stoke the fires that heated branding irons. You handled the instruments that might next be used against you, a quiet reminder that your suffering was woven into the household machinery. And yet, through all this, life kept moving. After a beating, you still had to grind grain. After a branding, you still fetched water. Punishment didn't pause your chores, it simply folded itself into them. The body learned to keep working while aching, because survival meant endurance. That ability to keep moving even in pain became its own bleak skill. But violence wasn't the only way women became enslaved. Many didn't start life in bondage, but were dragged into it through the chaos of war. And for them, the nightmare began, not in the home or the market, but on the battlefield, where defeat meant capture. War in ancient Greece didn't just redraw borders, it redrew women's lives. When cities fell and armies stormed through, it wasn't only men who paid the price with swords and shields. Women paid with captivity. The battlefield was rarely the end of the story, it was the beginning of another. For female captives, war meant being herded like spoils, marched away from burning homes, and absorbed into the slave markets that fed Greek households. Imagine the scene, smoke still curling from rooftops, the echo of shields clashing fading into the distance, and groups of women gathered together under guard. Some clutching children, some too shocked to speak, all of them stripped of the world they knew. Homer himself describes it in the Iliad. When Troy fell, women weren't killed outright. They were parceled out to victorious warriors as prizes. Even in poetry, their fate was set not by their own actions, but by the spears of men. Can you picture how terrifying it must have been to go from citizen to captive in a single day? The march that followed was its own punishment. Days of walking, carrying what little you could salvage, guarded by men who had slain your relatives. Food was scarce, rest was stolen on hard ground, and fear hung over every step. You weren't told where you were going. You were simply herded like livestock. And as villages along the way looked on, they saw not defeated warriors, but trains of women and children trudging toward a new life of servitude. Doesn't it sting to realize how war celebrated heroes while ignoring the suffering of those left in chains? Once you reached a city like Athens or Corinth, the next stage began. The conquerors sold you to the highest bidder, your identity reduced to a price. To the Greeks, this wasn't cruelty. It was normal procedure. To the women, it was the complete erasure of everything familiar. A home, a family, a city-state, all dissolved in the clang of coins. Famous names remind us how common this was. When Alexander the Great swept through Asia, entire populations were enslaved. Earlier, after the Peloponnesian War, Athens enslaved the women and children of Melos as punishment for defiance. These weren't isolated events. They were policies deliberate and systematic. History books often remember the strategies and battles, but between the lines were thousands of women forced into homes, workshops, and temples they never chose. And the humiliation didn't end once sold. Being a war captive carried a special mark. Masters knew your origins. You weren't just a slave, you were a Spartan captive or a Trojan woman, labels that forever reminded you of lost identity. Plays like Euripides's The Trojan Women captured this anguish, queens reduced to slaves, mothers torn from children, dignity shattered on the altar of conquest. To audiences, it was drama. To the women living it, it was biography. Children of war, captives inherited their mother's fate, just as with women born into slavery. A girl taken from a captured city gave birth to another slave, ensuring the conquest never ended. It lived on in her descendants. Imagine knowing that a single defeat condemned not only you, but generations to come. Isn't it haunting how one moment of war could ripple forward for centuries through bloodlines? Even years later, captives could still feel the sting of being outsiders in their households. Some never mastered the language of their new city, making communication another chain. Others carried accents that marked them as foreigners, distinguishing them from native-born slaves. That accent was its own brand, a sound that told everyone you belonged somewhere else, even if you would never see that place again. And yet, through all this, life had to go on. Women swept floors, raised children, cooked meals, all while carrying memories of cities that no longer existed. They became ghosts of conquered nations haunting the households of their captors. The world saw them as laborers, but inside they carried entire vanished homelands. War made slaves, but households kept them invisible. And invisibility, being erased even from the pages of history, was its own form of cruelty. Their voices dissolved into the noise of markets, their names forgotten in the ledgers, until all that remained were silent figures moving through the corners of a world that refused to see them. Invisibility was not an accident. It was deliberate. Enslaved women's lives were so ordinary to the Greeks that they barely seemed worth recording. Citizens filled inscriptions with dedications to gods. Philosophers scribbled about virtue. Generals carved their victories into stone. Yet the women who polished their floors and raised their children disappeared into silence. Domestic invisibility was itself a punishment-erasing identity until only function remained. Think of how names anchor us in history. Free women were named on grave stelae remembered as daughters' wives or mothers. Enslaved women, if mentioned at all, appeared only as possessions in estate inventories, reduced to one maid or two girls for weaving. Can you imagine an entire life summed up as a line item, as if your existence were no more significant than a clay jar? It's chilling to realize how paper-thin memory can be when society refuses to value a life. Even Greek plays so full of gods and heroes kept enslaved women in the margins. They might appear as comic relief or as tragic background, but rarely as individuals with voices. Euripides' The Trojan Women is one of the few works that shines light on captive women. But even there, their words were written by a free man, performed for audiences who could sympathize in the theater, then walk home to households where real captives lived unseen. Isn't it striking how art can illuminate suffering, while real life continues to ignore it? Inside the home, invisibility was constant. You might prepare food, yet no one praised your cooking, it was assumed. You might raise children, but their gratitude went to their mothers, not to you. Your labor filled every hour, but your presence was meant to be silent background taken for granted. Modern workplaces sometimes talk about invisible labor, the unpaid work of caregiving, cleaning, emotional support. Ancient Greek slavery was that idea pushed to its harshest extreme, a life where invisibility wasn't occasional, it was permanent. Archaeology sharpens this picture. In wealthy Athenian graves, free women were remembered with carved reliefs showing them seated receiving jewelry or shaking hands with loved ones. In contrast, the enslaved often had no markers at all, buried hastily in unadorned ground. Their stories ended not only in silence, but also in unmarked earth, the final proof that society considered them interchangeable. Doesn't it hurt to think of so many lives passing without even a stone to whisper their names? Yet invisibility had its paradox. The very absence of enslaved women from records reveals how much they must have been present. If every household required them, if temples and markets relied on them, then their silence is evidence of their ubiquity. Like the mortar that holds stones together, they were everywhere and nowhere. You don't see mortar in a building's facade, but remove it, and the whole structure collapses. Enslaved women were the mortar of Greek society, unseen, but essential. There's a faint thread of irony here. Greeks loved to speak of immortality through memory of kleos, the glory that comes when your name lives on. They carved their names into stone, sang them in poems, dreamed of living forever in reputation. But the enslaved women who washed their clothes and bore their children were denied even the smallest echo. Their kleos was silence, their immortality, a blank line. Isn't that the cruelest inversion of all, that the ones who kept society running were the ones erased from its story? Still, invisibility did not erase humanity. Women whispered to each other in kitchens, carved small marks into pottery, or left faint traces in the ways they raised children, comforted each other, or resisted in tiny acts of defiance. Those glimpses remind us that even when the world refused to record them, enslaved women carved memory into life itself. And beyond invisibility lay another layer, being made visible only for exploitation. For many enslaved women, the household silence was broken only when they were put into workshops, mills, or brothels. Their bodies and labor turned directly into profit. If the household erased you into silence, the economy shouted your existence in another way, by wringing every ounce of value from your labor. Female slaves were not only servants in private homes. Many were sent into workshops, weaving mills, or taverns, where their work generated direct profit for their masters. This wasn't simply about chores anymore. It was about economic exploitation, where your body and time became the gears in Greece's commercial machine. Weaving was one of the most common assignments. Looms clattered in cramped rooms where women sat for hours pulling threads until their fingers grew raw. The textiles they produced clothed households, stocked markets, and even paid temple offerings. Imagine watching a bolt of cloth leave the workshop sold for good money, knowing you would never see a single coin. Doesn't that sound like the worst kind of factory job, one where your sweat produces wealth you're forbidden to touch? Workshops demanded more than weaving. Some enslaved women baked bread in commercial ovens, turning grain into loaves that fed whole districts. Others brewed wine, pressed olives into oil, or rolled clay into pottery. These weren't leisurely crafts. They were relentless industrial-scale tasks performed under pressure to meet quotas. The products carried prestige, sold in markets, or exported abroad, while the women who made them remained nameless. And then came the darkest assignments, being forced into taverns or brothels where women's bodies themselves were turned into income. For owners, this was a practical investment. For the women, it was the sharpest reminder that slavery stripped not just freedom, but identity. You weren't seen as a person with desires or dignity, only as a source of revenue. The fact that this was common practice woven into city economies makes it all the more unsettling. How do you process the idea of being treated as currency, your worth measured in someone else's profit margins? The state sometimes benefited directly. In Athens, brothels were taxed, turning the exploitation of enslaved women into civic income. Citizens boasted of democracy, but their democracy was literally funded by women who had no vote, no rights, and no recognition. Isn't that irony almost unbearable? The city that invented liberty built its systems on bodies denied liberty entirely. Economic exploitation didn't stop at labor, it stretched into breeding. Some owners arranged pairings between enslaved men and women, not for affection, but for offspring. Each child born meant another future worker or commodity to sell. It turned motherhood into an investment strategy, an unsettling fusion of biology and economics. Can you imagine living in a system where even your family life was reduced to someone else's ledger, and still daily exploitation carried a strange invisibility? The women bent over looms, kneading dough or carrying amphorae, weren't written into contracts of sale or celebrated for their skill. They existed in shadows, their work taken for granted. Yet without them, households would falter, markets with thin temples would lack offerings. Their invisibility was a mask hiding how essential they were. Sometimes traces slip through the cracks. Inscriptions on pottery hint at workshops staffed entirely by enslaved women. Ancient jokes mention taverns run by girls who pour more than wine. Even legal cases record disputes over ownership of women skilled in trades. These fragments are the closest thing to names we have, the ghostly echoes of lives that churned profit but never reaped it. Economic exploitation may sound abstract, but picture this: a woman at her loom in Athens weaving until her eyes ache. Outside citizens stroll in fine garments, debating politics under the colonnades. The cloth on their backs, the bread in their hands, the oil in their lamps, all come from enslaved women's toil. And yet those women never appear in the histories of glorious Athens. Doesn't that make you question what history chooses to celebrate and what it deliberately leaves out? And as if economic use wasn't cruel enough, enslaved women also carried another burden. Even the law itself refused to recognize their voices. When wronged, abused, or humiliated, there was nowhere to turn, no court to listen, no justice to claim. If labor and profit defined one side of slavery, silence before the law defined the other. Enslaved women in ancient Greece had no legal standing. They could not testify in court unless tortured, their words dismissed as unreliable, unless forced out under pain. Imagine living in a society that claimed to love justice while refusing to hear your voice unless it was dragged out through suffering. Doesn't that make justice sound like a hollow ornament, polished for display, but empty inside? When disputes arose, the courts turned to masters, not the enslaved. If a woman was beaten, assaulted, or wronged, she could not file charges. Her pain was not considered her own. It was treated as damage to her owner's property. Picture breaking a pot in the agora. The issue wasn't the pot's experience, it was the potter's loss. That was how the law saw an enslaved woman. Her body wasn't hers to defend. It belonged to someone else's balance sheet. This legal invisibility stretched into every corner of life. Marriage was not recognized for slaves, so bonds of affection meant nothing before the courts. If you built a family, it existed only by your master's tolerance, not by law. Children could be sold, unions, broken promises erased with a single transaction. And the courts never intervened because for them, those ties never existed in the first place. Greek thinkers even justified this silence. Aristotle argued that slaves were living tools meant to serve the household. Tools don't give testimony, tools don't have rights. That reasoning, repeated in polished sentences, bled into legal systems and daily practice. Imagine being described in lofty philosophical terms as though you were a hammer or plow, then watching that definition shape laws that decided your fate. Doesn't it feel absurdly cruel when brilliance is used to defend brutality? Even when slaves were brought into legal proceedings, the method was twisted. A master could demand their testimony only under torture. Claiming truth could only be forced from pain. This practice wasn't rare, it was standard. Courts believed that fear and suffering stripped away lies. Yet for enslaved women, it wasn't about truth at all. It was another form of humiliation, turning the body into both evidence and victim. The absence of legal recourse wasn't just theoretical. It shaped daily survival. A free woman wronged by a neighbor might take her case to a magistrate. You, as an enslaved woman, had only two options: endure silently, or hope your master cared enough to act. Most didn't. Your suffering ended where their profit or pride began. Think of how modern systems still sometimes ignore voices from the margins. It feels like history's long echo, doesn't it? Historical records show this clearly. Court speeches from Athens mention slaves, but always in passing as background or property. Demosthenes, for instance, references slaves as evidence in disputes, not as people with grievances. Their presence in legal texts is like furniture in a room acknowledged only for how it serves others. The law was a stage, and enslaved women were props, never actors. The cruelty is sharper when you realize how proud the Greeks were of their courts. They boasted of juries drawn from citizens of orators who crafted dazzling arguments of laws that set them apart from barbarian nations. Yet all this brilliance excluded the enslaved. Their democracy and justice existed by drawing a line, and enslaved women stood firmly on the wrong side. Isn't it strange how societies build shining ideals on the very backs they refuse to acknowledge? And so the silence of enslaved women before the law deepened their invisibility. Their bruises, their stolen children, their broken families, none of it counted in the courts that claimed to weigh fairness. To be alive, but unheard, present, but legally absent, is its own kind of torment. But silence wasn't the end of their suffering. In many households, women weren't just ignored. They were displayed, used as warnings. Their pain turned into symbols for others. Some cruelties weren't hidden in the shadows at all. They were staged. In many Greek households, enslaved women were treated not only as laborers, but also as examples. Their suffering became a warning to others, a living message etched in bruises and scars. If beating one slave kept 10 others obedient, masters considered it efficient. It's a chilling logic, isn't it, turning pain into policy? A mistress might order a punishment to be carried out in full view of the household. Children, other servants, even visiting relatives could watch as a woman was struck or shamed. The act wasn't simply about correcting her mistake. It was about broadcasting a message. This is what happens when order is challenged. Doesn't that sound eerily like how some workplaces today make an example of someone except here? The consequences were written across the body. Branding scars, iron collars, and shaved heads were also symbols designed to mark a woman as disobedient. These signs followed her everywhere, visible proof of past defiance. Imagine trying to regain dignity when your punishment itself became your identity. The mark didn't just live on your skin, it shouted your shame to anyone who saw you. Even literature reflects this. Greek comedy leaned on jokes about slaves being beaten or mocked, turning their humiliation into spectacle. Audiences laughed, but enslaved women lived that spectacle daily. They were walking reminders, their silence reinforcing that laughter could mask suffering. Doesn't it sting to realize that what society finds funny often hides what someone else finds unbearable? Public places became stages too. If a slave was accused of trying to flee, her punishment might be paraded in the agora, where citizens gathered for trade and debate. The very heart of Greek civic pride doubled as a theater of cruelty, and the crowd, instead of intervening, often nodded along. For them, it wasn't injustice, it was order being maintained. The symbolism extended into ritual. Some households deliberately punished enslaved women during festivals, believing that discipline during times of celebration reinforced authority. While citizens sang hymns or celebrated the gods, slaves might endure punishments just beyond the temple walls. The message was sharp joy, and freedom belonged to some pain and silence to others. Even within the household, masters sometimes forced enslaved women to stand or kneel in humiliating positions for hours, using their discomfort as a visible deterrent. No words needed to be spoken. The sight alone warned others to obey. The cruelty was efficient because it was constant, woven into the background of daily life. The irony: Greeks prided themselves on symbols. They carved myths into pottery, raised statues of heroes, painted stories of gods. Yet the most powerful symbols were the ones they created in flesh and blood women, whose suffering became a living emblem of obedience. These weren't myths or statues. They were people forced into the role of permanent reminders. It's worth pausing on how effective fear can be. Invisibility made enslaved women seem insignificant, but symbolic punishment made them hypervisible, turned into cautionary tales. They existed at two extremes, erased when useful, displayed when suffering. That tension between silence and spectacle was itself part of the system's cruelty. And yet, even within this suffocating environment, enslaved women sometimes found ways to push back. Their resistance wasn't open rebellion too risky, but small acts of defiance, subtle gestures that slipped under the notice of those in power. Resistance didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered. For enslaved women in ancient Greece, rebellion often meant small acts, fleeting moments of defiance that carried enormous risk. You couldn't storm the gates or rally a revolution, not when chains, laws, and punishments closed in from every side. But you could spill a little wine while serving, hide a scrap of bread, or whisper forbidden stories to children at night. These were the quiet rebellions, tiny fractures in the wall of control. Think of the kitchen. A mistress orders you to prepare a meal, and you obey, but you sprinkle less spice than requested, or let the bread bake too long. To her, it's a nuisance. To you, it's a moment of choice proof that you are not entirely erased. Doesn't it sound almost absurd that burning bread could feel like victory, yet in a life where everything is dictated, the smallest decision becomes rebellion? Coins were another opportunity. In markets, some enslaved women found ways to skim a little from transactions, tucking coins into folds of clothing or hiding them under loose stones. Saving a handful of drachmas could take years, but even that small stash represented something radical hope. The dream of buying one's freedom, or at least easing the burdens of daily life, burned quietly in those hidden caches. It wasn't common, but it was possible, and possibility itself was defiance. Words, too, were weapons. Teaching a child a forbidden song, sharing old stories of homelands long gone, or reminding each other of lost traditions, all were ways of keeping identity alive. The Greeks prided themselves on preserving memory through poetry and history, but enslaved women preserved their memory in whispers, carrying culture not meant to survive. Isn't it striking how memory itself can become rebellion when others try to erase it? Sometimes defiance appeared in the most mundane gestures. A glance exchanged between two women at the loom. A pause in work longer than allowed a muttered word under the breath. These weren't grand protests, but they were signs that spirit had not been broken completely. Even silence could be reshaped into resistance, refusing to speak when ordered, forcing the master to repeat commands. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. Of course, the risks were brutal. Being caught hoarding coins, sabotaging work, or refusing orders could bring beatings, branding, or separation from family. That's why these acts had remained subtle, tucked into the cracks of daily routine. Resistance lived in the margins, not the headlines. Have you ever hidden something so small that only you knew its worth? That secrecy magnified the value, turning a crumb of bread or a copper coin into a treasure chest of courage. History rarely records these small rebellions, but hints remain. Inscriptions occasionally note slaves who bought their freedom, suggesting hidden economies at work. Comedies mention slaves who talk back, exaggerating real moments of cheeky defiance. Archaeology shows household shrines where enslaved people may have left offerings in secret, creating pockets of faith outside their master's control. Each fragment suggests that invisibility wasn't the whole story. There were sparks in the darkness. The irony is that even masters sometimes recognize these sparks. Ancient writers warned that slaves could be cunning, that they might sabotage or deceive. Those warnings preserved in texts are backhanded compliments. They prove that enslaved women were not passive tools, but thinking, choosing individuals who found ways to bend rules however slightly. Doesn't that hint of fear in the master's voices? suggests the power hidden inside even the smallest rebellions. These quiet acts didn't topple the system, but they mattered. They carved out slivers of autonomy, reminders that enslaved women were more than property. And every coin saved every burnt loaf, every whispered story was a seed planted against despair. Yet for all the courage in small rebellions, freedom remained rare. For most resistance was a daily flicker, not a doorway out. Manumission, the act of being granted freedom, was the distant hope dangled like a prize, but seldom given. Hope was a dangerous thing, yet it lingered. In ancient Greece, manumission, the granting of freedom, was possible, but it was rare, often dangled like a lantern just out of reach. For enslaved women, the idea of release shimmered faintly at the edges of life, tempting enough to endure another day, yet elusive enough to remain almost mythic. Sometimes, freedom came through purchase. A slave who managed to save coins, perhaps hidden for years beneath loose stones or tucked in scraps of cloth, could buy her liberty if her master allowed. Imagine handing over a pouch of coins, each one representing years of small risks, only to see freedom sealed not by your will, but by your master's permission. It wasn't independence, it was transaction. Doesn't that sting, knowing your life could be reduced to a price tag, even in liberation? Other times, freedom came as a reward. A faithful servant might be released in her old age when her body no longer carried the strength for work. Some owners manumitted women to appear generous before their peers or to gain divine favor. In Delphi, for example, inscriptions record slaves sold to Apollo, a ritual way of granting freedom under the god's protection. These stones still stand etched with names that flicker like sparks from the darkness. Yet even these stories remind us freedom often came not in youth, when it could be lived fully, but in weariness, when little life remained to enjoy it. Manumission didn't guarantee equality either. A freed woman remained marked by her past, often tied to her former household through obligations. She might still owe service on festival days, or carry stigma that barred her from true acceptance in society. Children born after her freedom might inherit better chances, but she herself could never fully step into the circle of citizens. It was freedom, yes, but a freedom bounded by invisible walls. And then there were promises that never came true. Some masters spoke of freeing their servants in wills, but death debts or disputes often blocked those promises. Imagine living your whole life on the hope of a line in a document only to see it erased by heirs who valued profit over honor. That's the cruelest edge of dangling freedom. It turns hope into another form of control. The rare stories of success shine all the brighter against this bleak backdrop. A few enslaved women did win release, building small lives of their own, sometimes even setting up households or businesses. Their names peek out of inscriptions, faint but real. They remind us that endurance could sometimes break the chain, though never without scars. These are the exceptions, not the rule, but exceptions prove possibility, and possibility is enough to keep hope alive. Think of the paradox. A system that built itself on erasure still left behind traces of hope carved in stone. In those carved names at Delphi or Athens, we hear voices whispering, "I was here. I lived. I was more than property." And isn't that the heart of resistance, to insist on being remembered even when society tries to forget? For most enslaved women, though the cycle never broke. Born into bondage, sold at markets, worked to exhaustion, silenced by law, displayed as warnings, resisting in whispers, most never tasted liberty. Their lives ended as they began within the walls of servitude. Yet the very fact that we can trace their outlines today, faint as they are, is proof that invisibility was never complete. The system tried to erase them, but memory has a way of surviving in cracks, in fragments, in questions that refuse to go away. And so, when we think of ancient Greece, not just its marble statues or eloquent speeches, but the hidden lives beneath, we glimpse the horrific normalcy endured by enslaved women. Their silence was not consent. Their invisibility was not absence. They lived, labored, suffered, resisted, and in rare cases glimpsed freedom. To tell their story now is to break the silence history tried to enforce. And now, as the echoes of history settle into silence, you can rest, knowing you have glimpsed the unseen lives of enslaved women in ancient Greece. They were born into chains, displayed in markets, worked to exhaustion, silenced by law, and erased from memory, yet their quiet endurance carried civilizations on their backs. Their voices may not have reached parchment, but tonight they have reached your ears. Let their resilience linger softly, like distant footsteps fading into the dark. You don't need to carry their burdens, only to remember them gently. Close your eyes. Let the weight of centuries drift away, and allow sleep to come like a kind release, where even the most forgotten souls can finally find rest.